One Piece has recently had its once-a-decade big resurgence, with the unveiling of Gear 5 and the plot accelerating faster than my vehicle towards pedestrian crossings when Freebird comes on. As the title states, yes, I do believe that One Piece as a whole is mediocre. The reason I made this video is because people in my friend group have picked up One Piece and claim it's better than sliced bread and, well, I just can't tolerate such falsehoods. Now, as a premier weeb, you may ask the valid question, how on earth is this an outside perspective? Well, I didn't keep pace with One Piece at all and I binge read it in 2 days about a month ago. Before then I was up to date with major happenings in the One Piece world, and I watched Marineford as it aired. That was, in fact, the only portion of the One Piece anime that I watched at all. Of the big three, I watched Bleach, mostly for art style, but I do think that it was the best choice. This does not extend to everything post-Aizen, but I won't allow myself to get sidetracked that severely. In essence, it's an outside perspective because, like 99% of the fanbase, I wasn't following it since its first release. Really stretching the soul of the video essay series, but my backup reasoning is that I'm not a fan. So there you go. For what it's worth, the only person in my friend group who has been following One Piece since before its most recent spike in popularity says that it's just alright. But now comes the time when I give the spoiler disclaimer, in that I will be talking about everything up to the most recent chapter release, so leave now if you want to avoid those. I will also only be taking the manga into consideration for 2 reasons. 1, I only read the manga and haven't watched the anime. It would take 20 times as long to watch One Piece than to read it, at least with all the fillers and the like. 2, the manga is the original work and so it best reflects the author, Oda Nobunaga's, intent. In matters of discrepancies, I will always side with the manga. Now, with that lengthy preface out of the way, I can finally tear into the meat of this manga. Let's start with the characters because I have the most to say about them. The main cast does not get much love. Zoro's backstory was touched upon for probably 1 chapter, where his sexist origins were revealed because he couldn't contend with a tomboy that lost his stares. He's not really sexist, but the community noticed that he may house a different brand of tomfoolery. Basically, that's all we know about Zoro. He's fiercely loyal to his crew, and all he cares about beyond that is honing his sword skills. Those are literally his 2 motivations. I would say he looks good in fights, but in the manga half the time it's just a classic frame of him having dashed past his opponent and then they erupt with blood. Sanji blows. He's actually wasted potential despite all that's gone into him. First off, he's the only character to have gotten 2 origin story sequences, one with the chef, the other was Germa. The chef plotline was fine, and it established Sanji well as a character, but the Germa plotline was largely superfluous. It added practically nothing to Sanji's character, and only really existed to have another faction in Whole Cake Island. Well, I would say it damaged his character because he is supposed to be the smart one, but then he gets cuffed like a moron. It legitimately felt like a gag. But what is Sanji's character? Well, he is a chef above all else and will feed anyone who is hungry. He is chivalrous in that he will protect women, but he is also a simp in that he can't interact with women. Not a flirt, a simp. He is supposed to be the smart one of the monster trio, and he goes around tying up loose ends while the other 2 beatstick everything down. That is Sanji's character at introduction. Post-time skip is another story, and I have a lot to say about it. The flanderization of this man's character needs to be studied because holy hell, he is no longer anything but the biggest simp, bar none. You could total all the simpery in One Piece, including that of Boa Hancock and all her victims, and it wouldn't hold a candle to a single super chat this bastard sends on an hourly basis. He needed a blood transfusion because he got a nosebleed after seeing a woman. That was an actual plot point. His other character traits are pretty much non-existent at this point, and even if they weren't, they are completely overshadowed by these stupid gags. Tony Chopper is not a character post-time skip. He is a med pack and a marketable plushie. That is it, and I am not exaggerating. His backstory in Antarctica was interesting upon its release, but it's pretty much a non-factor the instant he joins the Straw Hats. Nico Robin had the best character development pre-time skip. She began as an enemy in Alabasta, then she joined the crew with uncertain intentions, and then she betrayed them and left. We see through one of the only well-placed flashback sequences that she has major trust issues, but this wasn't exactly why she left. She betrayed the Straw Hats because she felt like she was a liability, since the government would hound her relentlessly for being the only person they know of that can read tablets. On top of all this, she is tired from having to run and be paranoid from every encounter, so she just wants to die. A woman after my own heart. This culminates in the single most emotional moment in all of One Piece bar none, where her desire to journey with the Straw Hats outweighs all her emotional baggage. How does this great character development translate into post-time skip? It doesn't. She is the book-smart one, but she also plays along with the crew's gimmicks and tomfoolery. This makes her the most likable Straw Hat by default since she has no annoying gags, but it is definitely wasted potential. How about in combat? Well, Nico Robin has the chiropractor forma denied card fruit, which is pretty cool. She can grow body parts from anything in an indeterminate radius around her, which is probably just within eye shot. Her solution to most combat scenarios is flex spine harder, but you also get the giant form in Wano, which doesn't really compute in my head how she does that, but whatever. Overall, best Straw Hat by far. Give her more love, Oda. Nami, I do not like. Sue me. Well, to clarify, I think she receives an undue amount of affection from the fanbase. She is the ship's navigator, which she is pretty damn studious about. That is the last good thing I have to say about her. Once she betrays the crew and takes all their gold about 70 chapters in, we gotta look into her past. She had a pretty tragic backstory of having her foster parent killed in front of her and being worked like a slave. This is also where her greed originates from, because she has to pay off Arlong to save her village. Of course, Arlong doesn't care that she earned enough money to buy back the village and fully intends to work her to the bone until death. This culminates in a good payoff where Nami can't achieve her goals on her own and asks the Straw Hats for help. Overall, Arlong Park did a good job at establishing Nami as a character. What about afterwards, though? She's still greedy, risk-averse, and her most recurring gag is smacking Luffy as a straight man whenever he's being a moron. Post-time skip, Nami is pretty much the exact same character. Admittedly, she did go from 0 to 100 in terms of fan service, but I don't have any opinions one way or another on that subject. She was slightly redeemed in Wano when she did not disavow Luffy's dream, unlike the next character. Of all the Straw Hats, the only one I actively hate is Usopp. His introduction is one for one the boy who cried wolf. His backstory is that his dad left him and his ailing mother to go buy milk on Shanks' scam train. His main character trait is cowardice, and his combat style is using a slingshot to shoot random things that apparently only he knows the value of when they're in pellet form. Usopp is supposed to be a regular guy. He's probably physically weaker than mascot mode Chopper. But imagine Moomin Rider vs Sea King, right? Except Moomin Rider is running from Sea King. Then he sees a school bus of children about to get smushed by Sea King and he's still trying to run. Then he remembers that he verbally promised to each of them, individually, that he would save them. And he's still trying to run. Only when the children cry out to him specifically does he finally stop running, turn around, and get his ass beat. That is pretty much exactly what Usopp did to the Toto things in Dressrosa. As mentioned earlier, he is the only member of the Straw Hats who would disavow Luffy to save their own skin, as shown in Wano. In Water 7, Usopp had a falling out with Luffy over one of the dumbest reasons imaginable, with the explicit undertone being that he felt inadequate compared to the rest of the crew, which is true. He was right on the money with that one. But guess what? he came back as Sogeking and proved his worth, which was the only good thing Usopp has done the entire series. In the time skip, I even got my hopes up because he said he wouldn't be a useless bum coward anymore and had his 2-year training arc. Yeah, that didn't even last until Dressrosa. He was only confident in Fishman Island, which was fodder central. I could dedicate a whole video to why I think Usopp is an unlikable character with negative character development, but I don't think he's worth the time. Franky is a robot. He does robot things. His personality is being cool and over the top for Gundam children. There. I've described everything there is to know about Franky in 3 sentences. You might be asking, but what about his backstory? Well, in that entire flashback sequence and Water 7, his role was less important than Goldie Roger's ship. So no, I'm not going to elaborate on that. Brook I practically forgot about, but he pretty much just pumps out dad jokes about being a skeleton and has a really unentertaining bit of continuously asking for permission to look at women's panties. His role on the crew is being a musician. Actually, it's like my Sea of Thieves crew 3 years ago. Every crew needs a bard and 2 fishermen while I'm doing all the work navigating and changing the sails on a goddamn galleon. Never mind, not 2 fishermen, one of us is burning a fucking banana on the frying pan. Anyway, his backstory is also over in about 1 chapter, and is tied to a whale that is mimicking coding. Like I said, this is a character I forget about frequently. He's not even really notable in fights. I suppose he's a swordsman that is more finesse-focused than the beatstick Zoro, but in the context of One Piece, that just means he's a straight downgrade in combat. Now, for Luffy. He's dumb and a glutton. I've heard people counter-argue that he has high emotional intelligence. Sure. Pretty much nobody claimed that he doesn't. It just so happens that nobody has ever claimed with a straight face that Luffy is a smart character. Luffy's backstory is surprisingly unimportant. He had a rough and tumble childhood, and the one guy who died in his backstory flashback turned out to not be dead. The only part of his background that matters to the plot is that he's the son of Dragon and grandson of Garp. That being said, it's not like Luffy is unlikable. His headstrong nature is one you want to root for. It just so happens that in pre-time skip, Luffy is a beatstick on most islands. He's put out of commission so that the villain can wipe the rest of the crew, then Luffy stops being a moron, and then smacks the villain real hard. His solution to his schemes is almost always a bigger rubber fist. In post-time skip, Luffy is also a beatstick. His solution is still a bigger rubber fist, but now there's the addition of more hockey. Overall, Luffy is a likable character simply because his gags aren't as egregious as, you know, whatever the fuck Sanji is doing at any given moment. How about the antagonists? They're mostly memorable and fun. Take, for example, Enel. People seem to hate Skypiea because its build-up was huge and is isolated from the rest of the story, but I think Enel is a good villain. His observation hockey is so good that in this stage of the story he seems omniscient. He's cocky and untouchable, so much so that pretty much everyone in the arcs that fights him gets one-shotted. The only reason he gets beat is because Luffy wins the type matchup hard, and even then Enel is able to play keep away until he can get his giant airship and achieve his goal of going to the moon. There's real tension because up until Luffy gets off his ass, Enel somehow knows everything transpiring on the island, can go anywhere instantly, and can smite anyone easily. Every move the cast takes is a huge gamble, where it feels that the outcomes are either success or death. Of course, this goes out the window once Luffy is just immune to Enel's arsenal, but then we get to see how he fares on the back foot. The issue with One Piece antagonists is that they're usually not imposing. It's tough to say, but Enel might have been the most fearsome antagonist for the Straw Hats at the point in the story where they're introduced. Not the strongest. As a little modifier, you have to understand, Enel fostered tensions throughout the entirety of Skypiea, whereas most antagonists are shelved until it's showtime. Akainu, the man who killed Ace and scarred Luffy, has done nothing of note since Marineford. That was, up until the last chapter, but still didn't do much to foster tension. Whole Cake Island had good tension, because everything was contingent upon whether or not the plan to assassinate Big Mom succeeded, and everything up until then was adding to the stakes. Wano, on the other hand, did not have good tension. It was beast stick central from the get-go, and a lot of other islands are just like that. We can now move on to the story and story elements. Obviously, the overarching plot of the One Piece is to attain the One Piece. The framework is that the Straw Hats, on their journey to achieve it, have to solve issues on the islands they go to. As mentioned earlier, most of the time their solution is just a beat stick. Post time skip, there was a feeling of interconnectedness from Punk Hazard to Wano, since the Straw Hats were sequentially destroying the supply chain of smile fruits. The premise is fine, the execution is... well, let's get it out of the way. The biggest issue with One Piece's story isn't really even about the story. It's the snail's pace at which it releases. As an aside, it doesn't take super long to release between chapters, but the pacing is very slow. Apparently, Wano took 5 years to complete, and I can't even imagine retaining interest for that long considering that Wano was, again, just beat stick central. It's hard to criticize such a long and disorderly story as a whole, so I'm just going to move ahead to story elements. I'll beat a dead horse here, but One Piece kills no characters. It's hard to feel stakes in a story when you know that the cast will come out fine afterwards. The only character that died was Ace, the only key character, and you know what happened after that? A time skip, minus 50 points. Hell, even Ace's death wasn't particularly impactful because he showed up like 3 times prior to his death. In fact, Ace's death needed a goddamn flashback for his backstory a few chapters after Marineford just to try and get audience investment. But the guy already died. The moment passed. Kaido, the strongest creature in the world, killed a total of 0 people, including children and fodder, and frankly, I'm not even sure Pedro is dead. Usopp got his skull cracked open by a dinosaur, and he is fine. This also messes with the tension, and is why I said Enel might have been the most imposing villain in One Piece. He was introduced early enough that death could have been a factor in One Piece, but he's also the villain for whom character invulnerability was strongest, aside from maybe Kaido. Enel carbonized pretty much everyone in Skypiea, and I don't think a single one of them died. Another dead horse to beat. One Piece characters talk like the Riddler. If I were to take a shot every time a One Piece character referred to something as that person or that place, I would have flammable breaths. It makes no sense for characters to talk like this. Oda, please, just make up a name for these characters and use those instead. I get that you're trying to generate intrigue, but just saying their name would have the same impact. Obscuring names does nothing other than generate meme material. I mentioned the interconnectedness of the plot post-time skip, which I'll elaborate now, is not a good thing. The new world feels incredibly small compared to the islands of paradise because we've only looked from the perspective of the Straw Hats. Of course, you could argue that this goes to show the magnitude of the Yonko's influence, and that's fair. However, after having seen the Big Mom and Beast pirates, their influence over islands is pretty much just claiming it by planting a flag there. It seems staggeringly unlikely that every island houses some sort of scheme, especially since Kaido just sits in Wano. Big Mom is a bit more believable, but the extent of her influence over an island is probably just planting a food factory there. What I'm trying to say is that in the New World, we've pretty much only seen the brunt of Big Mom and Kaido's respective empires, and the other islands are a non-consideration, which is a bit of a shame. The bigger factor in the world feeling small though, is that characters are benched when they're not on screen. This was brought up when talking about antagonists, but it really applies to all characters. It doesn't feel like Akainu is waging the best marine offensive against piracy, and it doesn't feel like the Yonko, Shichibukai, or world government are doing anything, really. The only character that exists off-screen is Blackbeard, but Blackbeard doesn't exist on-screen, so it's a funny little trade-off. Mihawk? Benched. All the Marines? Benched. Other pirate crews? Benched. Give me something, anything to indicate that the world is turning when we aren't looking. The character motivations are also severely lacking. I'm not one to say that every character needs a deep motivation. I think that villains that are evil for its own sake are great. The problem, again, is the execution. When every One Piece character has a shallow motivation for their actions, they need to be hard carried by their portrayal, which I've already said is all mediocre at best. Big Mom's goal is to become an American citizen, and she's a pushover after Whole Cake Island. There's really nothing about that combination of motivation and character that is imposing. All of this together makes most chapters of One Piece difficult to become invested in. Marineford was great because it was the climax of pre-time skip, and served as a glimpse into the highest echelons of power in the One Piece world. It's like when you fight the penultimate boss in an RPG at the end of the tutorial, just to get your keys ticked in and humbled. There were real stakes, and it was the only time that Luffy faced consequences. Frankly, as someone who watched Marineford before starting to read One Piece at all, most of pre-time skip felt like a chore, and post-time skip felt inferior. The payoffs were weaker, the battles felt far less climactic, and the characters weren't evolving. The last two things I'll talk about are Gear 5 and Haki, both of which I dislike for similar reasons. I'll preface this by saying that Oda almost certainly did not plan out Gear 5 or Haki. You can go back and point to panels that alluded to their current portrayals, but Oda, as mentioned earlier, loves making vague panels and statements that can easily be rewired in retrospect. It's like Chekhov's pipe bomb. Haki, in its original iteration, was somewhat needed, and that armament was necessary to even the playing field with Logia's. Conquerors and Observation were neat and reflected character ambitions decently well. Current Haki is just a power system, another way for Luffy to beat Stick even harder. What is advanced armament? You punch harder and it does internal damage, or you punch without making direct contact. What is advanced Conquerors? You punch harder. What is advanced Observation? You dodge with lag switch. It's just excessive, and a rather uninteresting way of power creeping the Straw Hat's enemy's strength. Gear 5 is Toon Force. Luffy propelled himself out of Kaido's eyes. I don't like Toon Force in mangas. Granted, Luffy is limited by duration for Gear 5, but he jump roped the strongest creature, which again, how are you supposed to keep tension with nonsense interactions like that? It fits Luffy as a character, but it embodies a lot of the things I dislike about One Piece, namely flanderization, a lack of tension, and beat sticking. Also, it was not alluded to well. You might say, Joy Boy showed up in chapter 200 whatever, but that doesn't indicate that Luffy was going to become the guy through his rubber fruit. I guess you could argue that Luffy was doing stuff that rubber logically shouldn't be able to, but One Piece fruits in general don't conform to how they should be. Overall, I think that Gear 5 is a detriment to One Piece, especially when his strongest attack with it is just another goddamn beat stick. So yeah, I don't think One Piece is great. I would never watch it, but reading it wasn't awful. I genuinely think that most people who watch One Piece are experiencing some kind of sunk cost fallacy, where they have to enjoy it now. When reading One Piece, a lot of the time it was boring, and I put it down for a few hours. And I am the de facto trash manga connoisseur, so that's saying something. Genuinely, I think One Piece is like a 4 out of 10. Because there were good moments, but there's just so much that is uninteresting or infuriating for the length you have to read it. As always, thank you for listening. I understand that this video essay is a far cry from what the past two were about, but I just want to talk about things that I need to talk about. Need being very, very loosely defined. But yeah, I want to talk about One Piece, so here I am. Next video will be an inside perspective instead of an outside perspective, so there you go.